we can get started. Today, we are going to talk about kind of the synoptic problem. We're going to talk about the way the Gospel of Mark relates to our other two Gospels. And we will talk, as a few of you, I'm sure, are expecting, a little bit about Q. If you don't know what Q is, we will get there. And maybe a little bit even about we will talk a little bit about the Gospel of Thomas because it helps us talk about Q. We will look at a couple of things in Mark today, but unlike the other two meetings that we've had on Mark, we're not going to really dig into Mark's scripture. One of the most important things about Mark, one of the reasons that I am most interested in Mark, is because it is the oldest of our Gospels. It is the weirdest of our Gospels for a variety of reasons, and it tells us so much about the development of the Gospels. It is the sort of starting point, the trajectory as far as what is preserved in the historical record. Now, that said, the way we think about Q historically, and also as a bit of technology, and I'll talk about what I mean there in a minute, has changed drastically, especially over the last 20 years, but really in the last 5 years, there have been a number of really important books and contributions that have really changed the way we think about the Gospels in general. And then because Mark is weird, we think of even more differently about Mark. And I'll say a little bit about that tonight, but we'll talk more about this issue when it comes to Matthew. But in effect, and I'm going to go ahead and lay this out, it's probably not going to all make sense yet, but by the end of the night, it all will, okay? When we talk about the gospel, we're starting from the assumption that we know what a gospel is. Now, we know what a gospel is. It's the good news, right? It's the good news of Jesus Christ's life, death, works, everything that he did for us, right? That is what the gospel is, capital G gospel. But when we talk about a gospel as a type of text, it is a genre that really is impossible to define. I have read lots and lots of definitions of gospel. None of them work. There is always a very easy way to say this doesn't work for that example, right? It is impossible to define what a gospel is because our category of gospel is a category that is defined by those things that we have already decided are gospels rather than on the basis of what those things share, okay? So what is a gospel? Well, it's one of those things that early Christians thought was a legitimate story about the life and works of Jesus Christ. That's about as close as we can get. It's not a biography. It's not a history, at least not in the modern sense. It's not a novel. It's not even really a strict narrative because there's not a beginning, middle, and end in the sense of plot development. Of course, there's a beginning and a middle of end because there's a beginning and a middle of end of Christ's life. So then we're like, oh, so it is a biography. No, it's not a biography. The closest thing we can get to as far as talking about genre is an ancient thing that we don't really have anymore. It's called an eritology. It's a fancy word that you will probably never need to know, but that root, erite, is like the heights. So it's the story about the best things that someone did. So we get eritologies throughout the ancient world, and they list the great deeds that people did or the great miracles that they did if it's a holy person, right? That's very similar to what we have as a gospel, but it still doesn't work because it doesn't include so many other things that make gospels unique. So if we put Matthew, Mark, and Luke next to each other, they have all these interesting characteristics that they share that the genre of eritology doesn't include, right? Here's the thing. If we push a little bit deeper on this issue, what we're going to find very quickly is that the reason we can't put a genre around this list of items is because this list of items is a list of things that did very different things over the course of their history and which were concretized at particular points in the history of their use. Now, I'm going to back up and explain what I mean there. The Gospel of Mark, the first folks that used it were doing something different than we are doing with it. The Gospel of Matthew, same way, but the Gospel of Matthew looked at the Gospel of Mark, and they were doing something different than the people were doing with the Gospel of Mark. the Gospel of Luke the same, the Gospel of John the same, and so on and so forth, so that all of these folks are diving into the same stream of telling the story about Jesus's life and works, but they're not doing it in the same way with the same emphases, with the same goals. Okay, pause. We're starting to think maybe we do have a genre and it's just a weird one. Well, the problem is we have 3 examples of it, right? When we turn to our extra canonical gospels, and y'all, we have lots and lots of gospels that aren't in the New Testament, they don't look the same because they are used differently. Step back again. What's going on here? Text culture starts in about the 4th century. What we think of as text culture, sharing books, reading books for the content of the books independent of a teacher, really starts in the 4th century. And even then, it's not the dominant way that people use books. We need to change how we think of these books. Another setback. While that starts in the 4th century, texts start to proliferate. That is, they become affordable and things that aren't just in a rich person's house in the 2nd century, when there were some kind of developments around papyrus and writing styles around the Mediterranean. So it became more accessible to have papyrus. Lots of people knew how to make really crummy papyrus. So you'll sometimes find in a trash heap a piece of bad papyrus, and on it is written something like, I long for the papyrus of Appius. This papyrus from Rhodon is terrible. Like, like lamenting the quality of the paper that he's writing on. But it's still that, while that says, oh, poor, Johann or whoever, or I guess it'd be Ioanni, um, and his bad papyrus, but this poor person, right, has access to papyrus. This person in a different level of the economy now has access to material and apparently is able to read at least a little bit. Now, probably most of these folks and they're living, all of the examples that I'm pulling out of my butt right now come from the Oxyrhynchus discoveries, which is a very literate area. It's like if there was a city where the industry was known for making texts, right? That's kind of what Oxyrhynchus was. So even the poor folks there tended to have a higher level of literacy than the surrounding area. But we see there evidence that in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, this technology is becoming more democratized. It's not accessible to everyone. It's probably only accessible to the top quintile. That's not right. The top probably like 20% of the population, and even less than that is what we would consider literate today. But that is from like 1% of the population over 400 years. And again, by population, we are talking strictly about the population of people that identify with and practice Christianity. That is where our evidence comes from for this stuff. Okay. Now, getting back to our Gospels briefly. Some very important, relatively recent work, at least as far as when we think about the New Testament, has really proven in my mind, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that when we look at the Gospel of Mark, we're not looking at the same thing as our other Gospels. The Gospel of Mark has a bunch of strange things. Remember we looked at the ending and we talked about how there's 5 different endings in the manuscript history, and that those differences in the endings actually go back to about as far as we can see in the manuscript's lifetime. These eritologies, they were not closed books. These lists of the wonderful deeds that someone did. It wasn't, here is the wonderful list of things that John McMullen did during his lifetime. Add nothing, take nothing away, or you have sullied the scriptures, right? It was, here's the list of stuff that we know of. If you know of more in your community, add it and move on. That's the attitude folks had towards these kinds of texts, because this wasn't a text that was supposed to tell everybody Jesus' secrets. This is just a text that was supposed to live and move through communities along with a teacher, along with a community, along with a holy man, right? It's supposed to come along with the person that knows all the things that aren't in the book. The idea about these gospels changes somewhere between the time when they're written in the last quarter of the first century. And when we start to see people commenting on the way they're using Gospels in the last quarter of the second century. Before that, we have very few people talking about the use of the Gospel. We have texts in the interim period, but they're not talking about how they use the Gospel. And so that's the difference. There also, guys, there's really not very much in the second century from Christian hands compared to the rest of history. Okay, deep breath. Let's tie all of this together, and then we're going to look at the synoptic problem. So what's going on here is when we look at our Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which have, let me move my camera down, which have a special relationship to one another that we'll talk about today, we shouldn't be necessarily concerned with the fact that they disagree with one another, because these are three different versions that went into different communities and they did serve different purposes, and that was their expected use. That's what these communities expected. So if someone in the second century picked up Matthew and picked up Mark and saw the differences, they would note those differences, and then they would perhaps guess, as Clement did, about how it might be resolved, or they might suggest that we should trust Matthew over Mark for one reason or another. They knew about them. It wasn't a problem, and it also wasn't something that they tried to erase. It's just part of the way these texts came down. Now, I'm saying all of this because we live in a very different text culture that preserves texts, insists on their preservation, let nothing be changed. Your Bibles have long diacritical remarks at the bottom saying, well, in this papyrus, this is this kind of an O, and in this other papyrus, it's a different kind of O. Like, they just want you to have that information available in front of you. And of course, sometimes it's a bigger change than that, but like even down to that level of a remark is present in these, let's just call them footnotes. We should probably try to change the way we think about our Gospels. And here, I know I don't have to do the work of convincing you not to read your Gospel literally, but what I do want you to do is to try and think about them more playfully, not in the sense that you're going to go and rewrite them, though writing your own account of the Gospels has a long tradition of being a really good sort of mystical and theological exercise to sit down and see what rings most true to you, but rather to not try and read them so strictly. So in other words, don't bring your insistence on linear temporality to the structure of the events and the structure of the narrative, because someone writing in the first century might know very well that Jesus didn't sit down under a fig tree before he went down to Jerusalem and then come back from Jerusalem and see the same fig tree and remark that its leaves had fallen off, because of course he had cursed it because those darn figs. Matthew knew that. He wrote that to us, not to tell us what Jesus literally did, but to make a point about Jesus's ministry and what he went to Jerusalem for, right? We need to change how we think about what is literal in these texts, and we need to try and do our best to read them from the perspective of the authors. We can't really do that. We're not from the first century Mediterranean. We're from the 20th century American world. Completely different, and our texts have all of these burdens that our culture has added to them over time. What I'm asking you to do when you go to your Gospels, and this is especially easy with Mark because of all of its oddities. Go to it, read it, instead of as one long narrative, as little windows into Jesus's life and what is the lesson in this window, right? That's kind of already how we read it, but at least in church, the way the liturgical structure of reading a passage a day kind of is laid out. What I'm suggesting, though, is that that's actually how you should read it, even if you read it all at once. Okay, one more step back, and then we're going to jump into the synoptic problem. All of this together says the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and Luke are all a part of the same tradition that is intentional, giving them different names, which, by the way, doesn't happen until centuries after they're written, is a little misleading. Because someone encountering these three gospels in the ancient world isn't going to say, this is the Gospel of Matthew, this is the Gospel of Luke, this is the Gospel of Mark. They're all going to be the Gospel of Jesus Christ. And they might talk about the different versions that have come out of different areas, but that's it. We have other texts that are like this. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, is one of our extra canonical gospels. It is a sayings gospel, which means there's no narrative. If you think Mark has too little narrative, the Gospel of Thomas has no narrative. The Gospel of Thomas starts, these are the secrets which Jesus spoke to Judas Didymus Thomas. One day Jesus said this. At another time, Jesus did that. On a Tuesday, Jesus said this, and it's just like a saying, and then it moves on. The sayings are not connected. That's probably the earliest form of a gospel. That's what Mark started as. And then Mark, along with this sayings gospel that we'll talk about, informed Matthew. So the author of the Gospel of Matthew had the Gospel of Mark, and he had another sayings gospel that was just a list of the things that Jesus said and did. And if the thing that was in this sayings gospel wasn't in the Gospel of Mark, well, the author of the Gospel of Matthew added it because he sees himself as participating in this same tradition of gathering all of the sayings, gathering all of the deeds that were known about Jesus. What we are so curious about when we actually dig into this, and by we I mean Bible scholars and theologians that are dealing with this on a regular basis, is how would they have made the choice? Because we see a lot of evidence that they didn't just pick the things they liked. They genuinely agonized over this. They probably were comparing sources. They were trying to figure out where these traditions came from. And that's why there's so much it's a pretty complicated thing. Let me give you one of the examples of how we trust so many of these sayings. You wouldn't expect them to put in the embarrassing details, right? If they're editing for the sake of just making Jesus look good as opposed to trying to be accurate, they're going to leave things out. Like they'll probably leave out a lot of the things in Mark where Jesus literally scolds the apostles. Like when he says, "Oh, you stupid disciples, can you not understand me when I tell you 3 times?" Um, at the Garden of Gethsemane when he's asking them to stay awake while he prays. I'm going to pause there. I've thrown out a lot. That's our little 20-minute lecture for the day. I expect we'll need to talk about this for a minute. Are we following? And let me hit my 3 main points of what I want us to take away from everything I've just said. Number 1, the very idea that there are 3 separate synoptic gospels, that is the gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is a modern idea. They would have all been understood to be participating in the same tradition in the first and probably even the second century. But between the second and fourth centuries, as these texts move into different cultures, the tradition separates to the extent that nobody wants to put it back together because these gospels all have long lives of their own before they circulate in one copy, right? No email, no faxing. If you happen to have a complete gospel and somebody makes a copy of it, they might not have any idea that it's different than the one in the church that they went to the previous year. And because you don't get to go up to the front of the church in these ancient communities and just read the Bible, okay? So they're all believing themselves to be participating in the same ones. And in fact, there's good evidence that the Gospel of Matthew, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, thought that he was replacing the Gospel of Mark very intentionally. He's expanding it and replacing it. Gospel of Mark doesn't stop being used. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, on that basis, therefore, maybe we should rethink how we look at these gospels. And I'm not saying, oh, they're not literal. Okay, like, yay, we're progressives. We don't read the Bible literally. Yeah. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we need to change our attitude toward the gospels in the same way, like recognizing that they're all participating in the same tradition. Let's read them that way. And instead of pitting them against one another, let's see what wisdom they offer. And where they do disagree with one another, let's wonder why instead of being obsessed with explaining it. We don't need to explain it. we're not going to be able to explain it. So instead of wasting that energy, these texts disagree with each other. Do they disagree with each other intentionally? If so, I wonder if this author was trying to clarify something or make a different point. Okay, that's point 2. Point 3, these texts are uniquely Christian. There is not a text that is not in a New Testament that looks like one of these, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The very genre of gospel doesn't exist. It's not a thing. So if someone tells you something that compares these texts to a genre and says, oh, but it's weird because it doesn't have this, that, or the other, don't bother thinking about it, talking about it, arguing about it. Just say fine and move on, unless you think this is someone who's interested in talking about why I know they're not actually one of those types of texts. Why that matters? Well, there's 2 reasons, and they both come from the sort of far right of biblical criticism, and that is there's been a spate of arguments recently that no, the Gospels are actually a biography, or the Gospels are the same kind of history that we do today, and therefore they're eminently trustworthy, and we should read them. I like to use this word neo-literally. So it's, people that read the Gospel literally, they're not really reading it literally. They're bringing an interpretive lens to it, right? So there's this category of neo-literalism that I think catches that, because I'd say we read the Bible literally too. We're just using a very different lens. Okay,
That's
now
more pseudo-literalism, isn't it?
What'd you say, Tom?
I said that's more pseudo-literalism.
Right. Okay, so I've laid it out. We're very ready to move on to the synoptic problem, but I want to take time to answer questions or know what's especially unclear now. Yeah, Art. Oh, you're still muted. There you go.
Sorry.
Well, who wrote Mark?
We have no idea who wrote any of these. Mark was definitely a Jew in the Palestine in the area of Judeo-Palestine, probably in the environs of Jerusalem, and writing in, I would say, in 70 or 71, right after the destruction of the temple, but we don't really know more than that.
So there's a tradition that says that he's the Saint Mark who was
Mark Thomas,
Archbishop of Alexandria, and he was a child who was an eyewitness to Jesus. So I think you're saying that's a bunch of hooey, but
oh yeah, I should have started there. All of our gospels are attributed on the basis of legends centuries after they were authored, based on suppositions from the gospels. Most of those that we follow, they kind of begin with Irenaeus, though Irenaeus isn't super taken seriously, but people reiterate what Irenaeus wrote at the end of the 2nd century. Let me back up, because these dates are going to get confusing. Irenaeus was writing at the end of the 2nd century, but nobody took him particularly seriously until the 4th century, when his arguments became canon law. So that's what happened. Janet, please.
You may have answered this before. Why is Mark not the first gospel in the New Testament? I mean, and it was the root. It seems it would make sense.
So I should clarify, like, our knowledge of the relationships between Mark, Matthew, and Luke is almost entirely modern. It's the 19th century Germans that start to put this stuff together for us, but the evidence is really irrefutable, and it's really odd that nobody noticed before. But the missing piece was Q. Once folks got turned on to Q, biblical studies completely changed. And what Q is it's I'll go ahead and say this, and then I'll come back to why Mark isn't first. Q is short for Quelle, the German word for source. So we talk about the Q source. I probably made this joke. The source. It's just it's still entertaining to me. The Quelle source, the source. But it's this hypothesized source where when we compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are
Biblical studies.
verbatim similarities. So they weren't just, it's not that they just knew the same stories, they're copying. Like there can be a spelling difference in one manuscript, and we know that it was copied because like it's a misspelling, but the next scribe copied the misspelling. And so we know that there are literal copies by hand of the actual Gospel of Mark into the Gospel of Matthew, as well as other things, including the author of Matthew's own input and this other source, Q. And I will show you guys the evidence of Q in a moment. Now, the reason Mark's not first is because Matthew was just the more important gospel to everyone in the ancient world. Matthew was the most important gospel until it's probably the 6th or 7th century. Its only competition really being John, but John was so the gospel of the heretics, and I'm not saying that hatefully, just the church associated the gospel of John with people that had beliefs that they didn't like. And so that's why John never really was ascendant in the ancient world in the traditional church. John was the main text in a lot of Christian subcultures, and in fact, it was the only accepted gospel in a large number of communities, especially in Egypt and Syria and farther east.
Well, wasn't the order established, at some sort of convocation somewhere, right?
As with so many other things, by the time we get the law, the tradition has already been established for, in this case, literally centuries. Again, we have Irenaeus to thank for our Matthew, Mark, Luke, John order. Irenaeus thought Matthew was the most important, most spiritual of the Gospels, and he apparently wasn't alone. He didn't make this decision. He's just the earliest person referencing the fact of the order. We don't have, honestly, we don't have any trustworthy history for when the Gospels started to circulate together. By the time we see them circulating together, we also see evidence that they have been circulating together for a long time. But as far as we can tell, by the time you get 4 Gospels together, they are pretty much in the order that we have now. By the
It
3rd
was
century.
all copied by hand, right? I mean, there wasn't any printing.
Yeah, absolutely. Copied by hand by skilled laborers for the most part.
By monks?
Mostly, it's a little unclear. We have this sort of inherited scholastic narrative that monks did most of the copying, and in Egypt that's true, but it's not true everywhere. It was being a scribe was a very lofty profession, and there are plenty of scribes that scribed all kinds of religious texts. We have plenty of evidence from, in fact, the Oxyrhynchus trash heap that I talked about earlier. One part of the trash heap is outside of a scribal. It's been a long day. What's the word? Like a factory, kind of like just a place where they read. Sorry, they write all day. And there we see evidence of those scribes who were long thought to be Christian scribes, scribing, ethnic Egyptian religious texts, scribing Greco-Roman religious texts. Like they're basically, you pay them and they'll do the writing for you. They don't care what it is. By the time we get to the 4th century, it's mostly monks in Egypt. And in the 12th century again. And after the 12th century, in Europe, it's pretty much always monks. But in the in-between, it's a grab bag. Penny.
Excuse me, many years ago, so I won't remember a lot about it. I took a class on the history of the Bible, which was not about what was in the Bible, but it's how it came to be. And one of the things I do remember him saying that as it began to be written down, what was written down in the Old Testament stayed pretty much the same throughout. It never really changed. But the New Testament was, it was just changed a lot. There were a lot of differences, and some of it was just like you were talking about. They transcribed it wrong, different people writing it. But it was more that the Old Testament was pretty intact from its original, because it didn't start out written down, but from the stories.
Yeah, and that's the part. This is This is one of those common narratives that comes back, and I'm always quick to point out that all of the texts of the Hebrew Bible existed for centuries before they were written down. That's not true. All of the texts of the Torah existed for centuries before they were written down. It gets more complicated when we get into the prophets, especially. But they, like Genesis, is comprised of 4 different traditions stitched together. So when people suggest, yes, by the time it's written down and even before it's written down, it's associated with a tradition of memory in which even being able to um, attain to the highest levels of your religious vocation, you basically had to have at least the Torah memorized. And that sounds insane to us. Like, how could anyone do that? But in the ancient world, memory was the muscle that everyone flexed every day. They would think it's, and really, seriously, y'all, the fact that we commonly read without moving our lips or speaking the words, you go back 2,000 years, you might get executed. Like, that is insane. In the same way, the things they could do with their memory would seem insane to us because we live in a text tradition, they lived in a memory tradition, and they are fundamentally different. And when you live on the other side of one without being aware of those differences, you can really get confused about what's going on. Now, that said, there are many intentional changes to the Hebrew Bible. They stitch together 2 different narratives in Genesis. Genesis has 2 different creation stories that were stitched together, one of which is Sumerian and one of which is uniquely Hebrew. There are several other obvious ways that the Babylonian conquest left its mark on the Torah and the Bible. In ways that the texts were changed, but we don't, we don't have the text. We don't have any 2,500-year-old parchment to compare with. So what we have is a very rigorous memory tradition that we can see. In order to avoid giving a whole month of lectures in 5 minutes, let me step to some examples that will save us some time. When we think about the Hebrew Bible, what we can see from the most ancient copies that we can find to those from the medieval period is that there are no significant differences. The promises and the emphasis on scribal veracity and accuracy in the Hebrew tradition is not a legend, it is absolutely true. But to then suggest that there haven't been changes to those texts is just incorrect. There have been lots and lots and lots of changes, but they were very intentionally done, and most of them happened before anything like the texts that we know today were put down. Now, that said, that's part of the tradition. For most, I'm not even going to say most, I have no idea what numbers, but the Hebrew folks that I know, including a number of rabbis, are well aware of this, and they talk about it on Saturdays as much as they do in the classroom. Now, compare that to the New Testament. All of our texts are written between, let's say, roughly about 50 and about 140. And we don't have any manuscripts of them between then and the very, very end of the 2nd century at the absolute earliest. But I honestly think that our earliest surviving manuscripts are at least late 3rd century. So we don't know what might have happened in the interim. But what we do know is that by the time you get to the 3rd century, we have so many manuscripts preserving the history of even more manuscripts before them, and they are spread out across such a broad geographic region that when we take them all and we compare them against one another, and this is what modern biblical scholars do, the idea, the possibility that we are wrong about what is in your New Testament that you have at home is infinitesimally small, just by the order of statistics when we have compared tens of thousands of manuscripts against one another. Okay? Now, that said, if something happened in that period between when these texts are written and when we actually start to have a robust textual history, we don't know, we won't know, and we will never be able to know unless we find some other new evidence. I want to say there is really no good reason to suspect that. And in fact, everything that we see about the New Testament text tradition is that it remains consistent because very, very early, people decide it's important. But here's the benefit. Very, very early, from its inception, Christianity is a text culture. These stories don't live very long in the memory alone. They are written down very soon. So even if we have different details, look at the magnitude of the differences of those details. It's when did Jesus do this thing? It's not did Jesus do this thing? We can debate the miracles. We can debate all of that supernatural stuff if we want to on the basis of experience, but debating whether Jesus lived, whether Jesus was associated with these healings and went to these places and did healings, or people thought that he did them, that really isn't up for debate. And so that's kind of how I judge when I'm talking to somebody, and I do this frequently because of my work in the academy, when I'm talking to somebody who is not a Christian and wants to talk about the truth of something, wants to debate the truth of whether or not something happened. If they don't think Jesus existed, I'm walking away because they're not a historian. Like, we don't have anything to talk about. You've made up your mind on the basis of conspiracy theories. I will engage with folks that debate, like, was Jesus magical? And that's, if that sounds reductive, that is a question I get asked. Okay, I rambled again. Goodness, I'm rambling a lot today. It's 6:11. Okay, let's turn now, unless I just provoked any other questions, let's turn now and look at the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem, first of all, synoptic, synoptikos. This is a fancy word. It literally just means seen together. And I tell you that because it'll help you remember. The synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And when you see them together, you see that they are basically the same, right? And so John is not one of the synoptics. John is off doing its own thing way over there. John's in the swimming pool getting baptized again and again by a floating Jesus, while Matthew, Mark, and Luke are talking about how much Jesus suffered. That's that's the difference between these two traditions. John has super Jesus. When we do our deep dive into John, gosh, please come. It's going to be so much fun. Mark is very interesting, but John just gets wild. Okay, I'm going to share. No, I'm not going to show you yet. Okay. Sorry, it's been a very long day. So I'm already a little bit off kilter, but I love this stuff. Like, I will talk about this stuff for hours if you couldn't tell. The synoptic problem is, okay, we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke next to each other. These texts all look the same, but they disagree in all these areas. Why? That's the problem. Why do they disagree? Okay, so even if you haven't heard this term synoptic problem before, you know what it means. Why do our three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, disagree? And of course, you can carry it also to John. John just is not one of the synoptics. No one's going to be mad at you if you get that wrong, but just know John is not one of the synoptics. Now, the other big missing piece to understanding this, and now I am going to share screen, is what all goes into the Gospels that we have. These are some of the charts. That's too wide. Let's do it this way. These are some charts from the Wikipedia article on the Synoptic Gospel, the Synoptic Gospels. You can also get to it by going to the Wikipedia article for Synoptic Problem. If you're wondering why I'm using so much Wikipedia, I know a lot of the people that make the Christianity ones, or at least edit them. I know that these are particularly trustworthy articles. They're mostly done by grad students at universities that you have heard of. And it's basically publication level stuff that's free. They also have these locked. If y'all want to edit these, you probably can't. I would have to get approved because they don't know who I am. But if you have a question about the New Testament, underline New Testament, Wikipedia is probably good. Hebrew Bible, it's very, 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 very iffy. It really depends on what article you're in. Now, these are some of the different hypothesized relationships between our gospels that would explain how we get what we have. I am going to show you what we have in just a moment. We're going to look at the parable of the sower, which we've already seen in the Gospel of Mark, and I'm going to show you the same parable in Matthew and Luke, where it's all going to be on the screen at the same time. We'll look at how it's in different places in those three gospels. And then we're going to look at the Gospel of Thomas and the fact that in this other non-canonical gospel, we have the same parable. And so we'll interrogate that a little bit. That's about how much time we'll have left today. By the way, we're definitely going through 6:45 today. If you need to go at 6:30, because that's, I think, where it's advertised to end on some places, and then 6:45 in other places, just shoot me, say something in the chat, and we'll wish you well and pray for you when we get there. Now, what we have here are a number of great diagrams of both those ideas that have been accepted and those that have been rejected. I will tell you straight off the bat, the only one that's accepted anymore is this. It's the two-source hypothesis. It's sometimes called the four-source hypothesis. You can see that down here at the bottom of this section on Mark and priority, which is the hypothesis that Mark is the first of these. They are the same thing. Note, this is the square right here that's in the two-source hypothesis, and then we're adding two sources. So let me pause for just a second. Kathleen, do you remember these charts of the two and four source hypotheses?
The one that I knew was in a very basic source, The Life and Teachings of Jesus by Edward Bauman from about the 60s or 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a square in the middle with all those arrows. And I've just now logged onto the computer, and of course they're too small. I can't
Well,
see what's going on.
I can show you the Bauman one because Bauman was one of those who helped popularize.
That's the one that I always taught with Bethel and then Disciple. I always made copies for people. And there was, I think, Proto-Luke and an extra M from Matthew. And
right here. So here's the four-source version that has the extra Luke and the extra Matthew. That's exactly it. So basically, whether you hear four-source hypothesis or two-source hypothesis, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about the Gospel of Mark and Q. Those are our two sources when we have the two-source hypothesis. But even in the two-source hypothesis, the most ardent advocates of it, they also say, but even though the author of the Gospel of Luke uses a lot of the Gospel of Mark and draws on this hypothetical source Q, there's still other stuff in Luke that doesn't fall into those two categories, and we're going to call that L short for Luke. So that's the unique Luke material or the proto-Lucan material. The same is true for Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew draws on the Gospel of Mark. It also draws on this hypothetical source Q. And then it also uses proto-Matthew, or that other material that author had access to. So whether we're talking four source or we're talking two source, we're talking about the same thing. That is the only argument that any scholar takes seriously today. There is no other option, like period, end of story. There are a number of other things that have been suggested that have been roundly dismissed. The most popular still among conservative theologians and Bible practitioners is the Farrer hypothesis, which suggests that Mark informed Matthew and that the Gospel of Luke made use of both. This is to get rid of Q because Q suggests that there's a broader tradition than exists in our Bibles, and that bothers people that think that the Gospel of Mark was written in the year, like 32 or whatever, like right after Jesus died. The Griesbach hypothesis is another one. Note that this looks functionally similar to the Farrer hypothesis, but you're changing the order instead of Mark into Matthew into Luke. you get Matthew into Luke into Mark, but it's the same hypothesized relationship because the parallels are the same. He just interprets the parallels differently. Exact same evidence, exact same argument. This guy just interprets the parallels differently. You don't need to know any of these. I would say it's good for you to know the 2-source and 4-source hypotheses. I just show you how many options there are so that you see that this is a very, 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 very complicated way of thinking and talking. But I want to promise you, no one takes seriously anything but the 2 or 4 source hypothesis. There is not another option on the table, not at the moment. I'm not saying there won't be, but I'm saying at the moment there is not one. Okay, so now we've done that. What I want to show you now, dun 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 dun, I'm going to put this link in chat because this is fun. This is something that I used to teach with.
So Mark was one of 2 original ones that provided source material.
Yes, but Mark, well, yes and no. It's a little more complicated than that. Mark is one of the 2 that have survived or which we are sure existed. So Mark survives. Q, we are sure existed, but we don't have it. But we have the evidence of it. However, we also know that Matthew, the authors of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke also had other stuff, and we don't really say anything about what that other stuff was. It's not clear if they had another written source, if they have oral tradition. It's not clear where that other stuff comes from. So our
So you
4-source
were
hypothesis
talking
could be
about,
a 12-source hypothesis. There's no way to know.
you were saying earlier that there were, stuff added to these as they kind of evolved, as they were passed around, including Mark, right? So
Well, kind of. Mark
which,
is the only one that we see changes in its actual manuscript life. Otherwise, these are changes. What I was trying to get across there is that we would expect these kinds of texts to change over time, but in fact, they don't. And so it's weird that they don't.
okay, so Mark really didn't change over time. So you don't have to determine what version of Mark was used by Luke and
Exactly. And here's why. Because that thing that we call Mark, it didn't look like what Mark looks like today when the author of the Gospel of Matthew had it. It was another sayings gospel, almost certainly.
like Thomas.
Like Thomas, but already elaborated. Sorry, Tim and I have, this is a long conversation. So if any of that was,
I'm sorry.
yeah, this is back from, we did the disciple together. So we did a year-long Bible study together. Mark is one of the reasons Mark is the weirdest is Mark still looks like one of these texts that should be in flux, that people should be adding stuff to. And when we see that added long ending in the very early manuscript history of Mark, that we talked about is very strange, that Jesus's resurrection and the sending out of the disciples isn't in the original version of Mark. That's weird. So the adding of that to Mark is expected. What's weird is that's the only thing that is added to Mark, and our other gospels don't ever have anything added to them, despite the fact that they don't represent the complete tradition of things that happened in and around Jesus's life. So what we might have expected in the 3rd century is well, this did happen, and it was a huge scandal, but we might have expected the church to take all of these gospels and to harmonize them together into one official gospel. Part of the reason that didn't happen is because these gospels had been attributed to disciples. So it was no longer a random text that somebody compiled about Jesus. It was now a text that was compiled by someone else who was also important in their own right. And so getting rid of the gospel that we now know as the Gospel of Matthew is getting rid of the tradition around Matthew as well as that text instead of just building a fuller tradition around Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Seeing
And those people they're attributed to are people who directly associated with Jesus. I mean, like the disciples.
Yeah, that's
Apostles.
exactly what's going on. So on your screen, what you see is 4 columns, and they all scroll independently. This is going from left to right: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas. The reason Thomas is up there is not because you should go run out and buy the Gospel of Thomas and read it in church. The reason the Gospel of Thomas is up there is because the Gospel of Thomas is closely related to our synoptic Gospels. It's just a couple of generations separated. And I don't necessarily mean that it's older, though. When the Gospel of Mark was written, something like the Gospel of Thomas almost certainly existed, but it was not yet what we know of as the Gospel of Thomas. But a sayings gospel is what existed before any of our Gospels did. Again, a sayings gospel is just a list of the sayings attributed to Jesus. It usually also includes like very short, pithy versions of the miracle stories. And if you look over here, we can look at a couple of examples. So on the far right column, saying 8, and he said, the kingdom is like a wise fisherman who cast his net into the sea and drew it up from the sea full of small fish. Among them, the wise fisherman found a fine large fish. He threw all the small fish back into the sea and chose the large fish without difficulty. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. That's it. And then we move on to something totally different. Jesus said, now the sower went out, and then we get the sower. In our next saying, Jesus said, I have cast fire upon the world, and see, I am guarding it until it blazes. And then we go to the next saying. There's no narrative here. There's no connection. There's no building. There's no reference of the resurrection or the crucifixion. That's not a part of this tradition. But I'm going to highlight the sower is saying 9. We want to remember that. In addition to very obviously being related to our synoptic tradition, the Gospel of Thomas is a weird 4th century text that includes things like, Simon Peter said to him, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Jesus said, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you other males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. So maybe we don't want to go too far with the Gospel of Thomas in our religious lives, but it's still a text that is very important historically and for the way we understand early Christianity. And fascinatingly, it has some examples of our parables that look like they're even older than the versions that we have in Mark. So let's look briefly at the parable of the sower in our different versions. If we just look at the length, we can see that Mark has the longest version of the parable of the sower. That's not normal. Usually Matthew has a longer version than Mark. See if you can think about a reason why the parable of the sower might be longer in Mark. I will tell you a hint. It does have to do with the unique character of Mark and what Mark does with the sower. Luke is shorter. That's kind of typical for Luke. Luke often shortens the parables from Matthew and Mark.
But Luke's the longest gospel.
Um, Luke's another weird case. Luke adds a lot of narrative elements. Luke is the most narrative of the Gospels. It keeps things flowing in a way that reads like a novel instead of like the Gospel of Thomas. And then we have Thomas, which has the shortest version by far. So let's read the Thomas version of the sower real quick, and then we'll talk about what it tells us about formative Christianity. It says, Jesus said, now the sower went out and took a handful of seeds and scattered them. Some fell on the road. The birds came and gathered them up. Others fell on the rock, did not take root in the soil, and did not produce ears. And others fell on thorns. They choked the seeds, and worms ate them. And others fell on the good soil and produced good fruit. It bore 60 per measure and 120 per measure. That's it. Does anyone have a hypothesis for why Mark's got the longest version of the parable of the sower? You're all gonna slap your foreheads when I tell you.
It has to be with due to the audience that he's writing to. I
Yes, but you're leaving out something important. The parable of the sower is the example that the author of the Gospel of Mark uses to explain parables. So he gives a more extended version so that he can then explain it. And so then you know what a parable is, and he doesn't have to give the long version anymore. If we want to know what the original version was, it's almost certainly what we have over here in Thomas. Why do we think that? Well, if we were to go into the Greek, and this doesn't, well, I was going to say, unfortunately, this doesn't let me, but I guess that wouldn't be much help here. But if we were going to go into the Greek and we were to compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we were going to only pull out the Greek words that were exactly the same and in the exact same relationship to one another, what we would be left with is functionally what we find in the Gospel of Thomas. Now, the reason we can't be even more interesting with this and go and compare the Greek of these three with Thomas is because the Gospel of Thomas really only survives in Coptic. We have fragments in Greek, but we really only have it in an Egyptian language known as Coptic. But Coptic uses Greek loanwords, especially in Christianity, where there is not a native Egyptian vocabulary to deal with a lot of these terms. So when we read the Gospel of Thomas, we still find a lot of Greek words, and those Greek words tend to match up with the same Greek words in our Gospels. This is not because the Gospel of Thomas is important, really, especially. This is because the Gospel of Thomas is a sayings gospel that participates in that same tradition, and which may in fact be related to Q. Thomas
Excuse me.
is not Q, okay? That is vital. Don't tell anyone I said that. I'll get kicked in the butt. Thomas is not Q. Thomas looks like what Q would have looked like, and also includes things that it almost certainly got from Q or from another text that was copied from Q. Thomas has
Okay,
things that are
Brad,
more ancient than Mark. It also has a bunch of crap added to it from the 3rd and 4th centuries, and we have no good way of distinguishing. Kathleen, go ahead.
wasn't there a time, uh, uh, maybe it was during the Jesus seminar, when, because I could swear I had a copy a long time ago, people assembled stuff from the synoptics and published it as the Q document.
Yeah, you can still buy one. The best version that you can get is by Kloppenborg, Kloppenborg. But more and more folks are skeptical of these attempts to reproduce the Q
Yeah.
gospel just because when you dig into the Greek, it gets pretty arbitrary. Some things like the gospel, the parable of the sower are so close and so well documented that we really think we're quite close to what the original sayings gospel would have been. But otherwise, it gets a little more complicated, and we have to wonder. We're saving time by saying that there is a hypothesized Q source, but really there's a hypothesized Q tradition, and we know that the Q tradition feeds into this one written source that these three gospel writers all had access to. We'll go back to our charts in a minute. I just realized I didn't fully explain how we know Q exists. To which all these gospel writers would have had access to, but we don't fully know how it would have developed because we don't have a copy of it. So when we recreate it on the basis of our gospels, we're assuming that the Q source, that these authors put all of it in, but the problem is there are probably things that were in Q that Matthew thought were important that Mark and Luke didn't think were important. So there's probably a lot more Q in these gospels that we don't recognize because only one of our authors wanted to include it. Now, this gets into a little more complicated territory where we talk about the triple tradition and the double tradition. So the triple tradition is when something is in all three of our synoptics, right? And that doesn't tell us necessarily that it was in Q, though it might have been in Q. It definitely was in Mark, though. When we talk about the double tradition, that's when we're talking about Q. I'm going to click back over to these charts. So with these charts up, and let me see if I can get to our for source and make that as big as is reasonable. For source, there we go. When we have a verbatim exact copy of, oh, no, it's big. Oh, that works. When we have a verbatim exact copy, the vocabulary is the same, the spelling's the same, the verbal ending is the same, it's all written the same way in both Matthew and in Luke, but not in Mark, that's called the double tradition. That happens a lot, and that is the primary evidence for the Q source, because we know that the author of Matthew and the author of Luke had a written source that they both had access to, despite the fact that these authors are separated by decades and hundreds of miles of geography, and possibly even had different first languages. Lots and lots and lots and lots of reasons to very, very strongly suspect that the authors of Matthew and Luke never knew each other, never had cause to know each other, and that in fact they never even read one another's gospels. And yet, there are a large number of examples where they are exactly the same, and not in telling the same story, and telling the same story in the same words, they are reading the same document and copying the same document. That document, whatever it is, we hypothesize to be this Q thing. And the only reason it's hypothetical is because despite all of the evidence that tells us it exists, it doesn't exist. Now, when they discovered the Gospel of Thomas in the 1940s, everybody was like, oh, this is Q. Because we didn't have it. The folks had known of its existence, hypothesized its existence. They'd reconstructed large bits of what it would have included. And Thomas has many of those large bits of what it would have included. It doesn't have the narrative elements that folks had started to assume were what were added to Q as the gospel tradition developed. But it also has all that weird stuff. And so as excited as they got about Thomas, they knew they couldn't separate everything out, and especially because it was in Coptic instead of Greek, it became even more difficult. So we know Q exists. We doubt we'll ever find it, though there is some hope that something that looks like Q is somewhere in the, possibly hundreds of thousands of manuscripts in the Vatican. We know tens of thousands of unexamined manuscripts. But they don't let anybody in to look at them. So if it's there, until they change their library policies, we won't know. And it's not that they're like hiding the truth from us, like Dan Brown or Tom Hanks would have us believe. It's just they're very, very protective of their artifacts, as you would expect them to be. But the folks that are asking the questions like this are either Jesuits or they're not in the Vatican. The Jesuits publish for Jesuits more than for the world. That sounded mean. I love Jesuits and they do a lot of great publishing, but it's often not published in a way that anyone has access to. So you can get your hands on it. It's good stuff. Okay, let's go back over here. I'm trying to think of a good parable that's just the double tradition for us to look at. While I find this one, what questions have arisen in the last 20 minutes of me monologuing? Please, Penny. Oh, and I'm sorry, I didn't come back to you earlier.
In reading this Wikipedia article, and I was trying to find it again where they said it, that most of the people spoke in Aramaic. Is that correct?
Yes.
However, what was written was in the Koine Greek. And Wikipedia raised the issue, how did it get, who translated it? And then how did it get from that to that? Is that an issue or a non-issue or what?
It is a complicated issue, but it's also a non-issue because while we do think that Jesus spoke Aramaic, we know that his followers spoke all kinds of languages, and we also know that these texts were not written by Jesus or his followers, but by people at least 40 years after Jesus's death.
Mm.
Well, Paul writes only 20 to 25 years after Christ's death in Greek. It would be interesting if we had a trustworthy gospel attributed to either Peter or James. Unfortunately, we don't. We don't have a good example of a Hebrew gospel other than the Gospel of Matthew, which is so rife with internecine themes, intra-Jewish conflict, that it's hard to see what the actual idea of what Jesus did for Jews would have been. Paul gives us our best view, and it's in Greek because Paul wanted Gentiles to read. Basically, Christianity wasn't that important in ancient Israel, Palestine, is the long and short of it. At least not in the formative period. But I'm not going to feel comfortable leaving that there. To us, it is an important period, but for like that geographic area in the first century, there weren't very many Christians there, and they weren't really producing anything other than a culture that they then sent out. But their Jews weren't really taking, they weren't jumping into Christianity, as we are sometimes led to believe. And part of that is because their city was destroyed and they were kicked out of it, and then they had this whole issue with determining which one of the three guys claiming to be the Jewish Messiah after Jesus was the real one. And Bar Kokhba, the son of the star, boy, they really thought he was it in the 130s, and he wasn't. They all died, and then Rome destroyed Jerusalem again. That's what Rome tended to do. You guys bored? Okay, let's go destroy Jerusalem again. Oh, that's a mean joke. I shouldn't make that joke. Dr. Roll, please.
Brad, you had said when we started talking about the synoptic problems, the primary question was why they disagree. In summary, what would be your response? You know, what's kind of a, why did they disagree?
I think they disagree because they don't have knowledge of each other, and they seem to disagree to us because the goals that these authors had in putting these texts down were just basically not the same as ours. And so it is accurate to them. It's an accurate account as far as they're concerned. But with our assumptions about linear causality and journalism and history and how all of these things work, and our 12 years of required schooling, which even in Texas is good enough to give you certain ideas about how history should work, it just doesn't work for us. But the other side of that is they're also doing the best with what sources they have, and with their goal not being a perfectly accurate history, but being a lively and accurate spiritual account of Christ's life. And I know that this sounds like apologetics, and I I have to tell you it's not. I'm a huge skeptic. I really am. It's something that I'll do a talk on it at some point, what it's like to be a skeptic Christian. But I don't take any of this for granted, and I start from the assumption that these texts are trying to mislead me for the author's purposes, and that's why I think it's so important that we understand their relationships, because understanding the relationships between these gospels helps us to get underneath whatever this author or this author or this author was trying to get at, or didn't even realize they were putting into their work. And it helps us to see the bigger picture of what Jesus did in the world. And that's also why I think it's sometimes worth going outside of our Bibles to see what other people were saying. And we have to read those texts differently and examine them more carefully, but they're still very, very valuable to revealing Christ's teachings throughout history. So I don't, that's not even really a question that I start to ask, because I think when we ask why they disagree, we're starting from the assumption that they should disagree. And at least in the ancient world, folks wouldn't see these as disagreeing as strongly as we see today. And I don't mean that they wouldn't see the logical inconsistencies. They absolutely would see those. They are just as smart as we are. Just they don't have the same training as we are, and they have better memories than we do. But they would see those inconsistencies. They just would not interpret them as necessarily being factually inaccurate in the way that we look at them. We say, oh, that's factually inaccurate. This isn't an accurate text. They would say, you know, they've done the best with the sources that they had, and sure, I guess that detail probably isn't accurate, and yet I have preserved the truth of what Christ did as far as what you need to know about it, right? So we shouldn't be arguing about what day Jesus was born on, because we don't know. We're not going to know. There's not evidence for it. It doesn't matter. But we can know that, you know, Jesus was stopped all the time and asked for healings and blessings, and he did, and people believed it, and people followed him, and they gave up their wealth for him, and they went all around the world doing their best to promote equity and equality and to lift people up, basically out of suffering into a world where they can fully appreciate their relationship with God, and hopefully do the same for someone else. And all of these texts, even the ones that I don't like for theological reasons, do the same thing. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, a lot of theological issues I have with this text, but it tells the same story about Jesus, even if some weird 4th century Coptic monk had a real issue with women, and he did. And there are other places, like the saying that I read you earlier. But even there, he's saying, yeah, even women, as evil as I'm taught that they are in my monastery, they can be saved by Jesus. That's so funny. I just imagine this really angry monk, and many of these monks, that wasn't really their choice to become an abstinent monk. They had to leave the city for some reason, and this was the only way they could survive. So I just imagine this angry guy sitting in his room just ranting about women. Like he's just surrounded by a bunch of other abstinent, hungry dudes. So in papyrus together all day. Let's look briefly at a great example of the double tradition. Do we have time? Oh, we're over time. This is really, really short. Okay, I'm so sorry. The cursing of the fig tree, just because we've already talked about it today. It's only in Matthew and Luke. Excuse me. Matthew and Mark. It's not in Luke. Luke has a reference to the fig tree, but it changes it. It has, look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourself, and you know that summer is already near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. So we know that there's this broad tradition around fig trees, and in fact there's several fig tree sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that look like but are not exactly like any of our New Testament fig tree stories. But here in Matthew and Mark, let's find the part here. This should be the core. And seeing, I'm reading from Matthew right now, okay? Listen and read along if it's big enough. This is again from Matthew. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but leaves only. And he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. Okay, again, that's Matthew. If you have this open and it's big enough for you to see, I want you to read along in Matthew while I read Mark. If you have a Bible next to you, this is Matthew 21:19. Okay, so read that, and I will be reading Mark. Mark it's 11:13. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. So see, that's actually quite different And yet in Greek, it is almost all the same words. This is a bad translation that's kind of taken my point away from me, because there are 3 words that are added between, and otherwise these are functionally the same. But if we look at, listen guys, we're so out of time, I'm sorry. I'll send a follow-up email that'll have a better example. I didn't think about the need to bring in the double tradition. Because we want a couple examples of identical text. So I will send those out by email, and I will include a little bit of information there. This is oh, right. This is another place where there's competing interpretive traditions, so that's why they're not the exact same. Google double tradition and you'll find them, but I will send you a couple of the best examples where we have these verbatim similarities, and I'll go ahead and send that out to you guys this weekend, and we will maybe have a little follow-up session sometime during Lent, because we're not going to do our next deep dive during Lent, but we might have a little follow-up. Let's talk a little bit more about Mark. Otherwise, this is it. This is what deep dive's going to be like. We're gonna work our way all the way through the Bible. Usually we will do more talking, but I think for each series there will be one night where I just talk at my computer.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful.
Yeah.
So you think John won't start till after Easter?
I don't think so, right? Yeah, that will be the most fun one. I think associating John with Easter though, and that baptism and resurrection, it'll be a good connection.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to say the
You know,
briefest of prayers, y'all.
John has some parallels to the other 3 gospels, so.
It does. They tend to be have no overlap in the Greek though. Like even different vocabulary words to talk about the exact same object. Okay, I'm going to say the briefest of prayers, y'all. If you'll just briefly join your hearts with mine. Beloved Christ, thank you so much for enlivening this community, for drawing us closer to one another and closer to you. Please continue to work in our hearts and our minds, filling us with your wisdom and your light so that we find your truths in the pages that those have written about you, as well as in our hearts. All this we ask in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank y'all so much for joining me, and I will
Thank
look
you,
for you
Brad.
all on Sunday.
Night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks, Brad.
Hey, everybody.